This is Apologetics Profile, a podcast ministry of Watchman Fellowship Incorporated, Arlington, Texas, helping and equipping you to better understand the world of non-Christian ideas and religions, one conversation at a time.
Most of us are likely familiar with the popular television game show Family Feud. Contestants are asked relatively simple questions like, 100 people were surveyed, top 5 answers are on the board, name something you would find in a household junk drawer. Of course, if you have a junk drawer, you know there are far more than just 5 things in it. The challenge for the Family Feud contestant is to guess correctly one of the 5 most common answers given on the 100-person survey. In a similar fashion, our special guest on these next 2 editions of Apologetics Profile did a little survey of his own. His survey, however, included far more than 100 people. You might say it has been his life's work as a New Testament historian and scholar. He has surveyed thousands of sources, both Christian and non-Christian, liberal and conservative alike, over his decades of research, and has compiled what he believes are the top 5, sometimes less, sometimes more, minimal historical facts about the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. Dr. Gary Habermas notes that the minimal facts approach, quote, considers only those data that are so strongly attested historically that they are granted by nearly every scholar who studies the subject, even the rather skeptical ones. Most facts meet 2 criteria. They are well evidenced and nearly every scholar accepts them, end quote. To put it in Family Feud vernacular, thousands of scholars surveyed, top 5 answers are on the board. What are the most widely agreed upon, nearly indisputable historical facts about Jesus' resurrection? Might be a little too challenging a question for Family Feud, perhaps, but according to Habermas, there really isn't a feud about these facts among credentialed scholars who study them. But what exactly are these facts? There are 4 main ones, with an additional fact that doesn't quite meet the minimal facts criteria. Gary says that they have been distilled and modified over time, but the top facts are presently these. 1. Jesus of Nazareth died by crucifixion. 2. Jesus' disciples believe that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. 3. Saul of Tarsus, a zealous Jewish persecutor of the early Christians, was radically changed by what he believed to be his encounter with the risen Christ. 4. The skeptic James, the brother of Jesus, was radically changed. 5. Though technically not a minimal fact as defined by the aforementioned criteria, for not every scholar accepts it, Habermas still believes there exists strong evidence for the empty tomb, and thus it merits serious consideration, though not a minimal fact. The minimal facts approach was never intended to replace all the other historical facts in Scripture. It was never intended to be an infallible knockdown argument for Jesus' resurrection or a substitute for the Bible as a whole. Rather, it is but one way to start dialogue with our skeptic friends and neighbors. We might call the minimal facts approach a historian's Romans road, a quick historical summary or overview that can be utilized by anyone in beginning gospel conversations. Very similar to how people have used a handful of verses from the book of Romans in outlining a basic gospel message. But of course, there are much more wonders in the book of Romans and in the Bible as a whole than just a handful of verses. And there are much more precious gems to be mined from history regarding Jesus' resurrection as well. So in giving a defense for the hope that is in us, a minimal facts approach is a starting point, a place to begin, not the whole race. My conversation with Gary took place in January of this year on the campus of New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary during the Apologetics Conference Defend 2022. We had some delicious New Orleans French pressed coffee and chatted in the kitchenette of Gary's campus guest suite. My technical apologies for the very slight motor-like hum in the background. It is the refrigerator. As we began our conversation, I asked Gary to describe the evolution of his minimal facts approach. Gary Habermas.
Well, I start with a list of 12 to 15 facts, and it's different in different ones in my books because it's not that specific. These aren't the minimal facts.
Okay.
But from that list of 12 to 15, I draw my latest number. I've used as few as 3. Once in a while, I've used 1. And Mike does this once in a while, too. And we didn't know that we were each doing this separately.
Oh, wow.
But I'll use as few as 3, as many as 6. I might have used 7 once. But it's a very minimal amount of facts. Let's say I have 12 to 15. Out of those 12 to 15, I might take half of them. And more typical now, to start with 12, I do a half dozen. And those half dozen are the minimal facts. And if you said, well, if your next question is like, what are they? I'd say, it takes me 1 minute. Jesus died by crucifixion, number 1. Number 2, his disciples had experiences that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. 3, they proclaimed this event at a very early date, in fact, right away. 4th, their lives were utterly transformed. In Bart Ehrman's words, he's great on this. He goes, it's not the resurrection that founded Christianity. I'd dispute that with him, but he'd say, it's not the resurrection that founded Christianity, it's the disciples' belief in the resurrection. And he said, once the disciples believed in the resurrection, they turned the world on its ear.
Wow.
So that's my 4th point, because that's that transformation. If you turn the world on your ear and you walk away from tax collecting, 4 of them from fishing, you walk away from your business livelihood, you don't see your kids for a while, you walk away from your wife, you don't even bring money home when you come home because you're not making money.
Yeah.
And you're gone, and you're so mesmerized by this guy, you're following him for a career, and you love him to death, Jesus. You love him to death, and they're doing all this. That's transformation. Then he's taken from you, and you keep on. And in Acts chapter 4 and 5, when they say, quit preaching, because they whipped him once, quit preaching, and Peter says, well, you judge. Should we obey you or should we obey God? And of course, the famous statement, we ought to obey God rather than man.
Yeah.
So that's transformation. That's 4. And then 5 and 6, 2 skeptics. It's most likely there's other views, but only a minority of scholars think that James was a believer before the cross. They mostly think he became a Christian after the cross, but it had to have happened between the cross and the ascension, because right after the ascension in Acts 1, a bunch of Christians are gathered in the quote-unquote upper room, and pretty soon they're choosing the 12th disciple to take Judas' place. They choose Matthias.
Right. Yeah.
Well, it gives a list of people who are there, and it says the mother and the brothers of Jesus are there.
Wow.
Now, why is James there at the beginning? And another, maybe a deal that says, this is just an inference, why he may not have been there until the cross. Why does Jesus give his mother to John instead of to James? So it's sort of like where we say, well, I trust a believer more than an unbeliever because that's who I am. I'm a believer, so I'm going to trust another believer. So I think James's conversion comes in between the cross and that upper room.
Yeah.
And we have a book. It's a very obscure. It's actually a fragment that it's called the Gospel of the Hebrews, and there's little fragments of it. And in one of them, Jesus appears to James.
Wow.
And it's usually dated about 125 A.D., just a couple decades after the New Testament.
In Greek?
That's a great question.
I have not.
I'll bet you. I don't know.
Huh.
Gospel of Hebrews. I mean, it could be Aramaic /
Hebrew.
Hebrew.
Yeah.
But I think I'm going to guess it's Greek. But I don't know the answer to that. That's really good.
Okay. I've stumped Gary Habermas.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good question. But anyway, his appearance to James. So and then the last guy is, of course, Paul.
Yeah.
So, super fast, crucifixion, experiences believed to be resurrection appearances. They began preaching immediately. Their lives were transformed, as Bart Ehrman says, turned the world on its ear. James becomes a Christian because he notices the resurrected Jesus. Paul becomes a Christian on the way to Damascus for the resurrection of Jesus. Those are the 6 I use, and you're going to look hard to find an accredited scholar who's a specialist in New Testament. I say scholar because there's some guy who just goes off without credentials, and he's going to do they're all a bunch of baloney. They're all because they know where we're going. They don't want us to go.
Yeah.
Now I'm talking about a accredited scholar, a terminal degree,
Right.
in a similar field. So New Testament, maybe an Old Testament guy because he knows how to think about the New Testament, but a New Testament guy, a theologian, a classicist, an archaeologist, maybe a philosopher, somebody in a relevant field, and they know how to sift the data. And you are going to look hard to find anybody that denies any of those 6.
And that's why you focus on them, because the majority of viewpoints.
I would say the acceptance rate is up around 95, 98.
Wow. Now, the ones that are not, they're not evangelical, or they're not committed Christians, the hesitancy lies in the resurrection, doesn't it, Gary? That's where they stop and they say something like, well, we don't know what happened, but something happened. Is that kind of the consensus?
That is like the byline going back probably 3 decades in the material.
Okay.
They'll say something happened. I'm not prepared to say what it is, or I don't know what it was. That's the classic line. And when they say something happened, sometimes they'll add a keywords like, it was a real experience. I'm not saying that it was a bunch of baloney or they made it up. It was a real experience. I think they got the fact, I think they misinterpreted it or something, but it was a real experience. I'm just not prepared to tell you what the nature of this thing is.
Okay. And obviously the Christians will affirm the resurrection.
We'll say, I agree with everything you said, only I'm going to go a step further. I'm going to tell you what the experience was.
Right. Gary, a lot of our friends will say, you've heard that, I'm sure you've heard this, the atheists will say, well, I believe in one less God than you. I think Jesus existed, but he probably wasn't God. His story got embellished over time, whether historically or a resurrection. You and Mike Licona talk about this in your book. This objection that Osiris and Marduk and all of these other gods from the ancient Near East are sometimes brought into this argument that Jesus probably existed. Okay, we'll give you his existence, but it's there's been a legend that's built up over time.
He's a man nobody knew. We don't really know a lot of data about him.
Right. So the gospel is what we have historically, or the resurrection. This is all just encrusted narrative barnacles of extrapolations and things. And how do you address that?
I think you've given me 2 objections, so I'd like to know which one you want me to answer. One is this mystery religion, Hellenistic. They're borrowing stories from dying and rising gods who probably were born of virgins, did miracles, called the Son of God, and what do you know? Wing-a-ding-ding, he rose from the dead.
Yeah.
That's one. But just before you said, what about that theory? You said, I believe one less God than you and you.
Yes.
And that's
classic.
That's nice. It's a nice, catchy little thing. But on that one, I would say, all right, now look, I've given you 6 facts. Why don't you, instead of just kind of shooting the breeze and saying, I believe one less than you, I'm not going to take an amorphous answer like that. I'd like you to tell me which of those 6 facts don't you agree with. Now, tell me which ones don't you, and why don't you agree when your atheist New Testament scholarly friends would agree with them without question and tell you you're kind of crazy for not believing these facts. Not literally crazy, but you're off Main Street here.
Right.
So go ahead. So I'd say it too, but I'll give him a chance to So, which one don't you accept? On the other one, there's 100 things you could say. In this big thing on the resurrection I'm doing, I think I have 150 pages against that theory.
Oh wow!
Now I'll do it this way. There's a Scandinavian scholar. His name is Mettinger. And he says, I think there are pre-Christian mythical gods and goddesses. Like Christians often say Baal, but it's pronounced Baal. There's
a hyphen
break there, apostrophe. Baal. And he says, I think there's 3 deities. They didn't live, but there are 3 stories of people who apparently were believed to have been raised from the dead, and Baal was one of them. But the interesting thing about Menger is, he said, I know that almost nobody believes what I'm saying. In fact, to my knowledge, I think he says, I'm one of 3 scholars in the world that believe there are any of these guys before Christ. I'm one of 3. Well, now there's a 4th one who's a pretty big scholar, and he agrees with Mettinger's position, so that there are a few who teach this. And his name's Cook. Good scholar, very good scholar. And so there's a handful of these guys, but they're very rare. And the biggest named guys, there's 2 guys named Smith, Zachary Smith, Mark Smith, and the 2 Smiths, totally different guys. I mean, they're not related. And a bunch of other big names. I mean, Edwin Yamauchi, Old Testament. Metzger from Princeton.
Right.
Bart's not just
Bart's
professor,
mentor
but good friend.
Yeah.
Those guys, Metzger, Yamauchi, the 2 Smiths, and there's a long list of other equally people on level with Yamauchi and but the Smiths are even bigger on the subject. They all say it's hogwash. The point is that I'm not okay. They would say it's hogwash that the Christians copied from them, but that's not my point. They say it's hogwash that there ever were guys like that who were believed to have been raised from the dead. And Smith, one of the Smiths was from, he passed away in the last year, but he had a PhD from Yale, and his area was history of religions. And he was brilliant at it. In fact, he was a distinguished professor. I think his title was University Professor at Chicago. Now, Chicago was a top 5 school.
Yeah.
University Professor means, I've heard University Professor explain is you can teach whatever course whenever you want to do it. You're like, so this guy's big. And Smith has this little line. I won't do justice to it, but it's pretty cool. And Bart cites him. But Smith says this. In the ancient pre-Christian world, in the stories, occasionally might be a living person, but for the most part we're talking like half mythical people or all mythical people, Hercules. And he says, there were guys in the ancient world who go away for a while, nobody sees them, and they return. There are other guys in the ancient world who die and we never hear from them again. There are other guys who appeared to people, but they never died. He said, but one thing I'll tell you we don't have in the ancient world, this is Smith, I'll tell you one thing we don't have, somebody who died in the ancient world and then appeared. It's a one-liner. We got him doing all kinds of things, but not dying and then rising. Ehrman quotes it, and he says, I agree with Smith. And he goes off on these guys. I mean, it's Bart Ehrman saying there. So if there's none of these guys, there's at least two major problems. If they're not historical people, they're Hansel and Gretel type stories. What good is that? How is that a parallel to Jesus? Secondly, if even the Hansel and Gretel type, none of them die and rise, as Smith says. How can that even influence Christians?
Right.
And then there's even more critiques. I could go on for a long time. The New Testament language of resurrection appearances is the language of sight. Whenever you read the Greek, they said they saw something. It's a very important distinction. They didn't say, well, I heard this story once of a Hansel and Gretel where Hansel and Gretel were killed by the witch and they rose from the dead. They don't say there's a story that they go, I saw him later.
Right.
Oh. You thought you saw him? Yeah, and not just me. All 12 of us saw him together. Like in the Creed of 1 Corinthians 15, there's 3 group appearances. To the 12, to a group called all the apostles, which is a larger group, 500 at one time. So they use sight language. We saw him as a group. You saw him as a group? Yes, we saw him as a group. And so when they go, what about these pre-Christian, they go, number one, there weren't any of them. Number 2, you're not answering their question. The text says, we saw him. And you're going, well, there's this Hansel and Gretel story. I didn't say they read a book on the couch to their kid and stood up and said, yeah, it sounds like a good story.
Right.
I'm saying we saw him and in groups. So you're not doing justice to the thinking thing. New Testament professors today, they'll tell you the sight, that the language is the language of sight. They believed they saw something. And even Bart, what I just said, Bart would say, you got it right that time. They believed they saw something. But see, if they believe they saw something, that doesn't explain what Romulus and Remus did.
Right.
The tomb was empty. That's another problem. The fact that they did this, if this was just something that was like fell between the cracks, they should have like gone back home after a while and went back to fishing and gone back to their wives and children. But they do this for their whole lives. And then they're willing to die for it.
Yeah.
That's how sure they are that they saw him. So that's another. So you're building up these evidences that they really had a sight experience. That there's ways to get from they thought they saw Jesus to they really saw Jesus.
Oh, wow.
But Bart admits the first point. But how do you get from thought they saw to saw?
Yeah.
Got the empty tomb. If I mean, there's a lot of refutations, but if this was just a story and a tale and you thought it sounded good, you could have dug up the body and there would be a body in the casket, so to speak. His body would still be in the tomb. But this one's gone, so now you have another issue. You can't explain the empty tomb. So anyway, it goes on, and that theory today is in total disrepute. And I'm going to push people to pick a naturalistic theory.
Yeah. What are is there any substantive rebuttal to any kind of good, redeeming, challenging things coming from a naturalistic perspective in this? Like they stole the body, he swooned, wrong tomb, Jesus had a doppelganger, or is there anyone that's even comes close to maybe having any merit?
I think the only one, the most popular one, but still a real minority view, because today scholars don't usually pick naturalistic theories anymore.
Oh,
including
wow.
Bart.
Wow.
So I'd say if you had to pick one, I'd probably go with hallucination.
A grief hallucination or...
any kind. John Dominic Crossan, he takes the grief view, and then he says, I don't think they were hallucinations. So Dom Crossan really says that. I don't think they're hallucinations, but they had a natural event. He says, he's got a line he says over and over again, it's kind of cool. Dom Crossan says, human beings are hardwired to see visions.
Yeah.
He thinks people see them.
Okay.
But he says, so grief hallucinations are very common. And he explains it that way, but he doesn't think it's a naturalist. He's got some categories here switched because he says, I don't believe it was a naturalistic theory. But if a grief hallucination, if you think you saw your wife who just passed away, that's not a naturalistic theory because you really saw her. If you saw somebody you thought was her and it wasn't her, that's a naturalistic theory. But then Bart says, I don't believe in naturalistic theory. I think they're grief hallucinations.
Yeah.
But the language doesn't go together. I think he's not, maybe following out the applications.
Yeah. So when we're talking about what is being seen here, when you're talking to a skeptic, and they hear all this, and you say, okay, fine and good, but we're talking about the Bible confirming the Bible. What the Bible isn't a reliable source for history.
You're using a prejudiced source.
You're biased and you're just circular reasoning. All of this is dependent upon because the Bible says so.
Bart Ehrman answers that.
Okay.
And here's what Bart says. He says it's not because, and he says it kind of derisively. In the text, you can kind of see him sneering in the book. He goes, it's not because the Bible says so. That's what he says. He goes, let me give you an illustration. If you're doing a book on the George Washington and the Revolutionary War, are you telling me you're not going to interview George Washington? Or you're not going to interview a couple of his generals? Of course you're going to. They're eyewitnesses. They were there. You're going to interview them. But then you're going to turn around and say, well, they were all on George's side and they think he was the greatest guy in the world. So of course they're going to back George's story. And Bart says, no, they were eyewitnesses. They were there. And you will not skip them just because they're prejudiced witnesses. Yeah. He says they're reliable. Now, if they're prejudiced, we have to apply criticism to what they're saying. Well, couldn't it just have been this? Couldn't the guy been knocked on the head? Couldn't it have been a tornado? Whatever.
Yeah.
You can make things up, but that's what you do with witnesses. You check them with eyewitnesses. But he said if you do this Revolutionary War, you interview George and you interview the other guys, the generals. Right. And he said so it is with Scripture. No one said the Gospels, in his view, he said no one says the Gospels are without error. There's no legend, there's no myth, but you use them because they're your primary and earliest source. You can subject them, you can put criticism, you can apply criticism to them, but this is, you're going to the horse's mouth, so to speak. You're going right to the mouth of the witnesses. Of course you're going to interview them. And then he goes, not because it's in the Bible.
Yeah.
So he answers it himself. It's not prejudice.
Yeah.
And besides, if you go back to my minimal facts, I'm not trying to claim this whole thing as there's no problems here, there's no big questions. I'm not sure how Judas killed himself. There's a couple different ways to explain in Matthew versus Acts. But there's things going on there. But if you can't tell me what's going on with my 6 facts, and I think there's enough there to show the resurrection happened, you better work on my 6 facts, because how Judas killed himself is not going to help you get out of the resurrection.
Right. Just playing gotcha with some apparent inconsistencies doesn't really address the things that you bring up.
Yeah, I'll say this again. The most common objection to the New Testament by all critics across the board, the most common criticism from Friedrich Schleiermacher in his, he's called the father of German liberalism, and you go from him to date, the most common comeback is there are contradictions, inconsistencies, report that seem to be in flux, whatever, in the Gospels. There are problems in the Gospels where things are not totally ironed out. That's the number one objection. And my comment to that is like, yeah, do you really think it's a problem? The guy's going, so you admit this? It's irrelevant if I admit it. I'm saying, do you really think this is a problem? Well, I think there's those things there. Okay, let's just use your view that there's problems in the Gospels. Which of my 6 facts don't you agree with? Oh, I think they're pretty good. Really? Well, if I can get to the resurrection of the 6 facts, why do you care what happened to Judas?
Yeah.
It's a moot point. You think that because, let me give you another example. How many books in the library, anybody's big library, when you go to study the Civil War, Revolutionary War, the Russian Revolution, anything, when you go to study them, and you have a pile of books and you're getting ready to write your dissertation on this, isn't it possible that every book on that desk has at least one error in it, at least things that look like they're a problem, and if not within the same book, at least within that and the book, the next one on the list? All research is like that.
Yeah.
So if that's just the way you do research and you have to sift it and offer critiques of it, what's wrong with me doing the same thing with the Gospels? Well, yeah, because you claim it's this and that and this and that. That's irrelevant. That's not in view here. I'm not asking you what the Bible teaches, what your view of the Gospels are, what's my view of the Gospels. I'm asking what you do with my 6 facts, and so I'll keep bringing it back to the 6 facts. And if they can't do anything with the 6 facts, in my opinion, they're in trouble.
Yeah, and you've used these 6 facts for decades now, correct?
I have. I used them with Tony Flew. We started one of our debates, 3 debates on the resurrection. Tony Flew, the famous, the best-known philosophical atheist in the world. And we started out saying, do you agree with these facts? And Tony said, well, I might have some questions about... Oh, I didn't use the short list. I used the long list of the dozen. And he said, well, I might have a question about a couple of these, but I'm okay with them. You can use them here. So I went to town and I used them.
Awesome.
And then he had to figure out a way to get around it. He used hallucinations. And I said, well, why do you have group citations in the very earliest literature, which is pre-Pauline? When Paul was on his way to Damascus, this thing was already in existence. And if there's groups in it, how in the world can you get group hallucinations? And they try hard. They'll say, well, here's a group of people who in 1842 came up with something, and all the groups said they saw the same thing or something. So you get in there and you look at it, and they're like other cases, other examples.
Yeah.
And they didn't all see the same thing. Well, then the critic will say, well, maybe they had a bunch of individual hallucinations. Cool. But if they had a bunch of individual hallucinations, why do you get a group saying they saw the same thing? And the critic might say, well, it doesn't say they all saw the same thing. I said, oh, but it does. And where do you get that? Well, after Paul gives the creed in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, it goes through verse 7. In verse 11, see, in the creed, there's an appearance to 2 individuals, Peter and James, and 3 groups, the 12, all the apostles, and the 500. Then Paul says, last of all, he appeared to be, so there's 3 individuals and 3 groups, but the last one from Paul is not in the original. It's an add-on. He said, I added this one on. So there's 2 individuals and 3 groups. In verse 11, after just talking about this, he says, whether it is they, who's the they? The apostles, in particular, Peter and James, whether it is they or whether it is me, so we preach, and so you believe. Paul's saying, we're both preaching the same message. That's not the only place Paul does that. He also does in Galatians chapter 2. And critics believe that those 2 books, Galatians and 1 Corinthians, they believe they're 2 of the 13 books that have Paul's name on it, they'll give you 7. What I mean by that is they don't think Paul's inerrant or infallible, but they think he's honest. They think he's a good scholar. He's not going to lie on purpose. He was trained as a Pharisee. He knows how to do good research. He was a good man, knew how to reason. They'll grant all that. And we have two texts in Galatians and in 1 Corinthians that the Gospels believe the same thing. The apostles believe the same thing about about seeing Jesus one and all by themselves and in a group.
And in a group. Now, the historical quality of the manuscripts that we have today are unparalleled.
Anthony Flew in our debate, someone asked him a question, what do you think about the text in the New Testament? They all say they are like the best thing in the ancient world. I got a Buddhist text on my shelf that says, Buddhists don't have anything like you Christians do. This guy was a PhD Buddhist, and he said, my best sources that I'm bringing to your attention here today are 600 to 800 years after Buddha died. You got it from the beginning. So you have any number. So if there's one guy out there or two that say, the texts aren't as good as you think, as good as you think, not as good as you think does not equal not good.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Like you think it's a 10. I only think it's an 8.
Yeah.
Well, good. Thank you for that. I'll use your 8 instead of my 10.
Right. So we actually have. There's nothing like this in the ancient world as far as the text.
No. I mean, you might think of a really crazy example where there's one text for which they might have an original or a story. But I mean, an individual story. If you mean a narrative that goes for years with a number of things, there's really no parallel.
I know of an atheist. I was talking to him in social media. He was an atheist scholar, and he was kind of diminishing this idea of the manuscript quality and the manuscript amount and the manuscript evidence. But he basically said, so what if you have 6,000 or however many manuscripts? And so what if the dates are close? Who cares? So what are you trying to say? And I was only saying that I was only speaking about the quality of the manuscripts, and he was obviously coming from the point of, well, so what? That doesn't prove Christianity is true.
And a little tick too.
Yeah,
He of course can say a couple things. I gave you one example. One could say, well, I think this is a 10. You think it's an 8. I'll use your 8. You can go there. On other places, when the guy says, well, and this is a good objection, he could say, just because you have early sources from good people doesn't mean everything they said was true.
That was his response.
When you take witnesses of a car accident, and there's 3 who are, and when you when you boil everything down, and you got 3 excellent witnesses, and one says it was a green car, one said it was a yellow car, and one said it was a red car with green stripes. Mm-hmm. They're not agreeing at all, but they're all good witnesses. These guys can be good witnesses and get facts wrong.
Yeah.
And so I would wade in again. I say, let me ask you, do everything you can to avoid the issue. Can you tell me which of my 6 facts you disagree? Well, I'm not saying I disagree with you. Thank you. Do you admit them all? Well, I don't know if I'm saying that either. You know, you don't want to say it because you're going to be on the spot here. Am I right? Mm-hmm. You're going to be in the corner, and you're not going to I was debated a guy a long time ago. And it's one of my very first dialogues. This guy was an atheist, professor, and he said, in secondary school, and he said, I said, so what do you think happened? And he said, I don't think I'm going to tell you, because what you're going to do is you're going to paint me in a corner. I'm not going to be able to get out, and then you're going to say it in your face. Mm. I said, well, whatever you think I'm going to say or think, you're the atheist. It should be incumbent upon you to tell me something. He goes, I don't know. So the disciple stole the body. And I said, can't be this, the dumbest theory of all. This, it is the dumbest one. You could argue that nobody's held this theory for over 200 years among scholars. This, and this. And you know what the guy said to me? He goes, it was like a private dialogue, so it wasn't like on a stage. Uh-huh. But the guy said, look, you're starting to get me angry. You got me in a corner. I don't like it. As far as I'm concerned, and he had a pipe in his mouth. It said no smoking over the door. As far as I'm concerned, this debate is over. Put it down. Dialogue was over. I'm not talking about it anymore.
Wow.
So, I mean, and he was angry. I knew this guy. I had him for 2 classes, and he was a good professor. But he didn't know what to do with it, and he didn't like being put in a corner.
Do you think there's at the scholarly level, is there still that emotive component to this argument? Is that really It's
huge. It's probably the biggest single component.
Really?
how there's any question emotions. It's like in everyday life. Just because you're a specialist and you have a PhD doesn't mean you don't have emotions. Like if your wife leaves you, if your son dies, if you're whatever, don't tell me you're isolated from emotions because you have a PhD and you're a specialist in the field.
Yeah.
You're going to be close to the same kind of things. And I think that's unquestionably that most of this is emotional.
Yeah. So it's a volitional, emotional, almost more
Either
than it
or
is
both.
a scholarly issue, because it seems like you have, in terms of history and scholarship, you seem to have a pretty solid case for,
I think so.
for the resurrection and for the historical Jesus.
Correct.